Captain Marcus Cole stood in the massive greeting hall of the Valorian flagship and tried not to stare at everything around him like some tourist from a backwater planet. The walls were made of something that looked like frozen light in the ceiling, stretched so high that clouds actually formed near the top, and the air smelled like flowers that did not exist on Earth. He had been a soldier for 15 years, and he had protected diplomats and generals, and once even the president of the United Earth Coalition, and none of those jobs had prepared him for this moment. The Valorians were the oldest species in the known galaxy, and their empire had existed for 100,000 years before humans had even learned to make fire, and they looked at humanity the way a grandfather might look at a toddler learning to walk. Beautiful and ancient and impossibly powerful. And they had asked for a human bodyguard. Marcus still did not understand why the ambassador who had contacted Earth had been polite but vague, and he had said only that the Princess Alindra was difficult, and that she had escaped from 17 Valorian Guardians, and that they needed someone with a different perspective. Marcus had accepted, because refusing a request from the Valorians was not something anyone did if they wanted to keep breathing. Now he stood waiting and trying to look professional while his heart beat faster than he wanted to admit. The doors at the far end of the hall opened and light poured through them, and for a moment, Marcus could not see anything except brightness. Then she walked in. Princess Alindra was not what he had expected. She was small and delicate, and her skin shifted between silver and pale violet like oil on water, and her hair fell past her shoulders like liquid mercury, and her eyes were the color of lavender flowers and enormous in her narrow face. She moved like water flowing and like music playing, and like nothing Marcus had ever seen in his entire life. And she was staring at him with an intensity that made him feel like a specimen under a microscope. She stopped in front of him and tilted her head, and her lips curved into a smile that made his stomach do something uncomfortable. "You are the human," she said, and her voice was soft and musical and curious. "Yes, Your Highness," Marcus said, and he kept his voice steady through sheer force of will. "And I am Captain Marcus Cole, and I have been assigned as your personal security detail." She walked around him in a slow circle, and he felt her eyes moving over him like physical touch. "You are so solid," she said, and there was wonder in her voice, and so dense and warm, and Valorians run cold, you know? And our core temperature is barely above freezing. "By your standards, Your Highness," Marcus said, and he tried to keep control of the conversation, "and I need to establish security protocols for your safety." She stopped in front of him again and leaned closer, and her nose twitched. "You smell like copper." "And something sweet," she said. "And what is that smell?" "Coffee, Your Highness," Marcus said, and he was starting to feel like he was losing a battle. He did not even know he was fighting. "And now about your schedule." "Say my name," she said. Marcus blinked, and his professional mask slipped for just a moment. "I beg your pardon," he said. "My name," she said, and her enormous eyes were fixed on his face. "And say it, and not Your Highness, and I want to hear how it sounds in your voice, and human voices have such texture." This was not in any training manual Marcus had ever read. "Your Highness," he began. "Alindra," she said, and her smile grew wider. "And say it." "Princess Alindra," Marcus said carefully. She made a small sound of pleasure, and her eyes half closed. Again, she said, "We should discuss security protocols," Marcus said firmly, and he pulled his datapad from his belt. "And I have reviewed your schedule and identified 17 potential vulnerability points." Alindra laughed, and the sound was like bells ringing in a crystal cave. "The other guards always started with the protocols too," she said, "and they never worked, and I escaped from all of them." "I am aware," Marcus said, "and that is why I am here." She moved closer, and she was so close now that he could feel the cold radiating from her skin, like standing near a window in winter. "Do you think you can keep me from running away?" she asked. "No," Marcus said honestly, "and I think I can find you when you do." Something changed in her eyes, and for just a moment he saw something deeper than curiosity. and something that looked almost like loneliness. The others always tried to stop me, she said softly, and they built cages and they posted guards and they used technology to track me, and they never understood what Marcus asked, that I do not run away to escape, she said, and I run away to see if anyone will come looking. She stepped back, and the moment of vulnerability vanished, and her playful smile returned. I think I am going to enjoy this assignment, Captain, she said, and I hope you are ready. Marcus watched her walk away, and her silver hair flowing behind her like a comet tail, and he felt something in his chest that he did not want to examine too closely. He had protected presidents and generals, and he had survived 3 wars and 17 assassination attempts and 1 hull breach that should have killed him. None of it had scared him as much as the feeling he got when Princess Alindra looked at him. He pulled up his datapad and started reviewing the security protocols, and he told himself that this was just another job, and that she was just another assignment, and that the strange warmth in his chest meant nothing. He almost believed it, but deep down, in a place he did not like to visit, he knew that something had changed the moment she walked through those doors. He knew that this tiny silver princess, with her curious eyes and her cold skin and her habit of running away, was going to be the most dangerous thing he had ever encountered. Not because she might hurt him, but because she might make him feel something he had spent his whole life avoiding: connection. He shook his head and focused on his work and told himself to be professional. But her voice echoed in his mind, and her eyes haunted his thoughts, and her question repeated over and over. Do you think you can keep me from running away? No, Marcus whispered to himself, but I can find you when you do. And somewhere deep in the ship, a silver princess smiled to herself and thought about warmth and texture and the strange solid human who smelled like copper and coffee. She had escaped 17 guards. She had a feeling the 18th was going to be different. 3 days into his assignment, Marcus woke to an empty room and a missing princess. He had done everything right, and he had secured every exit and posted guards at every door and installed human-designed motion sensors that even Valorian technology could not fool, and he had been thorough and paranoid and careful, and yet Alindra was gone. Marcus did not panic, because panic was useless, and panic got people killed, and he had learned long ago to save his fear for after the crisis was over. He checked his equipment and pulled on his jacket and grabbed his weapons and walked out of his quarters with calm, steady steps. The Valorian guards were already in chaos, and they were shouting at each other in their musical language and sending search parties in every direction and contacting the king and preparing for the worst. Marcus ignored all of it, walked to the security station and pulled up the sensor logs and studied them with careful eyes and looked for the pattern that he knew had to be. Larry Alindra had told him herself that she did not run away to escape, and she ran away to see if anyone would come looking. That meant she wanted to be found. That meant she had left a trail. He found it in the maintenance logs and a single access code used at 3 in the morning, and a door that led to the lower levels of the station where the markets and the docks and the workers lived. When alone, the other guards wanted to send teams, and they wanted to alert the station security, and they wanted to make noise and show force and do all the things that scared prey into hiding. Marcus knew better. Alindra was not prey, and she was not scared, and she was waiting for someone to find her the right way. The lower markets were loud and crowded and full of species from 100 different worlds, and the air smelled like food and fuel and sweat and a dozen other things that mixed together into something almost pleasant. Marcus moved through the crowd and watched for silver hair and listened for musical laughter and followed his instincts deeper into the maze of stalls and shops. He found her sitting on a cargo crate behind a fried food stall, and she was eating something that looked like dough covered in sugar, and she was surrounded by dock workers who stared at her like they could not believe what they were seeing: a Valorian princess in the lower markets, eating street food with grease on her fingers. She looked up when he approached, and her face split into a Brilliant smile, you found me, she said, and her voice was warm with pleasure. And I knew you would. And the others took so much longer, and one of them never found me at all, and I had to go back because I felt bad for him. Marcus stopped in front of her and crossed his arms. This area is not secure, he said, and there could be threats. She pointed to a large figure slumped against a nearby wall, and Marcus recognized the species immediately, and it was a Kreth, and the Kreth were known for their brutal strength and their bad tempers. There was a threat, she said, and he tried to grab me, and I handled it. Marcus stared at the unconscious Kreth, and then back at the tiny princess who barely reached his shoulder. How, he asked. She smiled, and there was something dangerous underneath the sweetness. Valorians are quite fragile, Captain, she said. And so we learned other ways to protect ourselves, and we had to. And when you are small and soft, you learn to be clever and quick and precise. She hopped off the crate and walked toward him, and the dock workers scattered to make room, and they watched with wide eyes as she stopped in front of her. Human guard. But that is not why I came here, she said, and I wanted to see what you would do. And the others panicked and sent search parties and called my father and made everything loud and complicated. She reached up, and before Marcus could react, she pressed a cool palm against his cheek. You came alone, she said softly, and you came quietly, and you tracked me yourself. It is my job, Marcus said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. No, she said, and her lavender eyes searched his face, and it is more than that, and your heart rate just increased. And but not from fear, and that is interesting. She pulled her hand away and walked past him toward the exit. I will come back now, she said. But I should warn you, Captain, and I plan to do this again. Why? Marcus asked. She stopped and looked back at him, and her silver hair caught the light, and her eyes held something old and lonely and hopeful. Because you are the first one who makes finding me feel like being found, she said. She walked away, and Marcus stood frozen for a long moment, and his cheek still tingled where she had touched him, and his heart was still beating too fast. Followed her back through the markets and up through the levels and past the panicking guards, who stared at them both with shock and relief. She did not speak, and he did not speak, and somehow the silence felt more intimate than words. When they reached her quarters, she paused at the door. Thank you for finding me, Marcus, she said, and his name sounded different in her voice, and softer and more important. I will always find you, Marcus said, and the words came out before he could stop them. She smiled, and it was the most genuine smile he had seen from her yet, and there was no teasing in it, and no games, and just warmth. I know, she said, and that is why I keep running. She disappeared into her quarters, and Marcus stood guard outside, and he told himself that his racing heart was just adrenaline, and he told himself that the warmth in his chest was just relief. He almost believed it, but he knew the truth, and he knew it in the deepest part of himself, where he kept the things he did not want to face. He would find her every time she ran, not because it was his job, because the thought of her being lost made something in his chest ache in a way he did not understand. He was in trouble. He knew he was in trouble, and he did not care. The escapes continued, and Marcus learned to expect them. He found her in a xenobiology laboratory at 3 in the morning, and she was studying human tissue samples with the intensity of a scholar and asking the scientists questions they could not answer. He found her in the engine room talking to the human engineers about combustion and metabolism and heat, and she was fascinated by the way human bodies burned fuel and created warmth. He found her in the mess hall trying coffee for the first time, and she made a face, and then took another sip and declared it aggressively alive, and asked for a second cup. Each time she could have truly disappeared. And that Valorians had cloaking technology and phase-shifting abilities and a dozen ways to become completely untraceable. Instead, she left trails and breadcrumbs and hints, and just enough difficulty to make him work and never enough to make him fail. Marcus understood. what she was doing, and he understood that each escape was a test and each trail was an invitation, and each successful finding was a thread connecting them more tightly together. He should have reported it, and he should have asked to be reassigned, and he should have put distance between himself and this princess who was slowly taking apart all his defenses. He did none of those things. One night he tracked her to an observation deck on the outer ring of the station, and she sat alone in the darkness, watching a distant nebula paint the void with colors that had no names. He stood beside her and said nothing, and they watched the stars together in comfortable silence. "Why humans?" she asked finally, and her voice was soft in the darkness. "And your people have relationships with hundreds of species. And why did you request a human guard?" Marcus considered the question, and he had wondered the same thing since the beginning. "I have heard theories," he said, "and our aggression and our adaptability and our stubbornness." She shook her head, and her silver hair caught the starlight. "No," she said, "and that is not it." She turned to face him, and in the light of distant suns, she looked less like an ethereal goddess and more like something real and fragile and lonely. "Do you know what makes humanity truly terrifying to the rest of the galaxy?" she asked. Marcus waited, and he knew she would tell him, and he knew it would matter. "It is that you care past the point of reason," she said, "and every other species in the known galaxy has limits and logical breaking points where self-preservation overrides attachment and where survival instinct defeats emotion." She stood and moved closer to him, and her eyes were huge in the darkness. "But humans," she said, and her voice was barely a whisper in humans, "will die for strangers, and will cross galaxies for love, and will hold on to hope when every rational calculation says to let go." Marcus felt something shift in his chest and something unlock and something open. "That sounds more like stupidity than anything frightening," he said. "It is both," she said, "and that is what makes it so powerful." She was very close now, and he could feel the cold radiating from her skin, and he could see the tiny lights reflected in her lavender eyes. "My people live for thousands of years," she said, "and we are careful with our hearts because we have so much time to fill, and attachment is dangerous. When you might spend centuries grieving." She reached up and touched his face, and her fingers were cool against his cheek. "But humans love like you are already running out of time," she said, "and fierce and consuming and complete, and you do not hold back because you cannot afford to waste a single moment." Her voice cracked, and something in her expression changed. "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus asked, and his own voice was rough and strange. "Because I have been alive for 300 years, she said, "and I have studied 1,000 species, and I have learned everything about the galaxy, and none of it prepared me for this." "For what?" Marcus asked. "For you," she said, "and for the way I feel when you walk into a room, and for the way my heart beats faster when I hear your voice, and for the way I cannot stop thinking about your warmth." Alindra, Marcus said, and he did not know what he was going to say next. "I am terrified," she said, and she cut him off, and her eyes were wet with something that might have been tears. "And I have never been terrified like this, and I do not know how to make it stop, and I do not know if I want it to stop." She stepped back, and her hand fell away from his face. "This is why I keep running," she said, "and not to escape from you, but because I do not know how to stay, and I do not know how to want something this much." Marcus reached for her, but she was already moving, and she phased through the wall like morning mist and like starlight fading and like a dream ending. He stood alone in the observation deck, with his hands still outstretched and his heart pounding and his mind racing. She was 300 years old, and she would live for thousands more, and he was human and fragile and temporary. It should not work, and it could not work, and everyone would tell them it was impossible. But Marcus had spent his entire life doing impossible things, and he had survived wars and assassinations and the cold void of space, and he had never once backed down from something just because it was hard. He pressed his hand against his chest, where his heart was hammering, with something he finally allowed himself to name: love. It was love, and it was terrifying, and it was the most human thing he had ever felt. And he was not going to run from it. Not now, not ever. He would find her, and he would tell her, and he would prove to her that human love was worth the fear. He just needed one more chance. The Concordance Ball was the most important diplomatic event of the year, and every species in the galaxy sent representatives, and the Valorian flagship was filled with more security than Marcus had ever seen. He stood at the edge of the grand ballroom and watched the dancers spin across the floor, and the colors were blinding, and the music was strange and beautiful, and everywhere he looked, there were beings of impossible grace and power, but his eyes kept finding Elindrish wore a gown that looked like frozen starlight, and her silver hair was piled high on her head, and she danced with a fine Valorian noble who held her like she was precious and fragile. And his Marcus told himself it did not matter, and he told himself he was here to protect, and not to want her, and he told himself that the burning in his chest was just professional concern. He almost believed it. The noble spun Alindra across the floor, and she laughed, and her laughter was like music, and Marcus forced himself to look away and scan the crowd for threats. That was when he saw them, 5 figures moving through the crowd. And they did not dance, and they did not mingle, and they moved with purpose and precision, and their faces were blank and empty and wrong. Hollow men. Marcus had heard of them but never seen them, and they were bioengineered assassins without identity or history or anything that could be traced, and they were the most expensive killers in the galaxy, and someone had paid a fortune to send 5 of them. 5. For one princess. They were spreading out and surrounding the dance floor, and Marcus calculated angles and distances and timing, and he knew he could not stop all of them. He did not care. He moved before he thought, and instinct took over. In 15 years of training and 3 wars of experience, and every survival skill he had ever learned focused into a single point of action. The first hollow man fell with a knife through its throat, and Marcus had thrown his backup blade from 12 meters away, and it hit perfectly, and the assassin crumpled without a sound. The crowd started to scream, and the music stopped, and chaos erupted across the ballroom. Marcus was already moving, and the second hollow man met him in the middle of the dance floor, and they fought with brutal efficiency, and Marcus broke its arm, and then its neck, and let it fall. The third came from behind, and Marcus spun and caught its blade on his forearm guard, and the metal screamed, and sparks flew, and he drove his elbow into its face and felt bone shatter. The Valorians were backing away, and their faces showed horror and disgust, and they had not seen violence like this in centuries, and they did not know how to process it. Human violence and human fury and human willingness to become a monster if the alternative was losing something precious. The 4th hollow man had circled around, and it had a neural disruptor aimed at Alindra, who stood frozen in the center of the chaos, and her eyes were wide, and her hands were shaking, and Valorians were peaceful by nature, and she had never seen anything like this. Marcus did not think. He dove into the path of the beam. The pain was beyond anything he had ever experienced, and every nerve in his body fired at once, and his muscles locked, and his vision went white, and he felt his heart stutter and stop and restart and stutter again. He should have died, and humans were not supposed to survive neural disruption, and the weapon was designed to kill species far stronger than humanity. But humans did not know when to stop, and humans did not understand impossible, and humans kept fighting long after their bodies should have failed. Marcus rose. He rose on legs that should not work, and he rose with a heart that should not beat, and he rose with nothing but rage and love and the absolute refusal to let her die. The hollow man had exactly enough time to feel something like fear before Marcus reached out. He killed it with his bare hands, and he did not remember doing it, and he would never remember doing it, and some part of him was grateful for that. The 5th hollow man was running toward Alindra, and it had a blade in its hand, and it was so close, and Marcus could not reach it in time, but the Valorian Guards had finally shaken off their shock, and they moved with the speed of their ancient species, and they brought down the final assassin with weapons that burned like stars. It was over. The threat was ended, and Marcus collapsed, his body finally accepted what his will had refused, and his legs gave out and his vision went dark, and he fell to the floor of the ballroom surrounded by the dead, and they screaming. The last thing he saw was Alindra running toward him, and her face was twisted with an emotion that her species was not supposed to feel, and tears were streaming down her silver cheeks. Last thing he heard was her voice screaming his name over and over, and it sounded like grief and love and desperation, all mixed together. The last thing he felt was her cold hands on his face, and her body pressed against his, and her lips against his forehead, whispering words he could not understand. Then there was nothing, darkness, silence, peace, and somewhere in that darkness, a small voice told him to let go, and told him he had done enough, and told him he could rest now. But another voice was calling his name, and it was silver and musical and desperate, and it refused to let him fade away. Marcus, he heard, and come back to me, and please, and please, come back. He followed her voice through the darkness. He followed her voice back to life, because that was what humans did, and they loved past the point of reason, and they refused to let go, even when every rational calculation said they shouldn't. Marcus had never been very good at being rational. Marcus woke in a room made of light. The walls glowed with soft golden warmth, and the air hummed with energy, and he could feel healing moving through his body, like water flowing through dry earth. Valorian medicine was beyond anything humanity had ever created, and it rebuilt tissue and repaired damage and brought the dead back to life if they had not been gone too long. He had been gone for 37 seconds. 37 seconds of death and of nothingness and of the space between. Heartbeats stretched into eternity, and then he had come back. Alindra was beside him, and she sat in a chair that had been pulled close to his bed, and her silver hair was tangled, and her gown was stained with his blood, and she looked like she had not moved in days. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, and there were dried tear tracks on her silver cheeks, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "You died," she said, and her voice was raw and broken, "and you died, and your heart stopped for 37 seconds, and your brain activity ceased, and by every definition that matters, you were dead." Marcus tried to speak, and his throat was dry and rough, and he had to swallow twice before words came out. "Seems like I got better," he said. Alindra made a sound that was half laugh and half sob, and she pressed her hands against her face. "It is not funny," she said, and her voice cracked, "and I watched you die. And I watched you die for me, and for someone you had known for less than a single cycle of your short, impossible life." Marcus sat up slowly, and every muscle in his body protested, and the healing light increased and warmth spread through him like comfort. "You told me once that humans love past the point of reason," he said. She dropped her hands and stared at him, and her lavender eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I did not mean," she started. "I know what you meant," Marcus said, and he reached out and took her hands in his, and her fingers were cool against his. Warmth, and she trembled at his touch. "Alindra," he said, and her name felt like a prayer in his mouth. "Why?" she asked, and her voice was barely a whisper. "And why did you do it? And why did you throw yourself in front of that beam? And why did you die for me?" Marcus pulled her closer, and she came willingly, and she climbed onto the bed beside him and pressed herself against his side, and her cold seeped into him, and his warmth seeped into. Because you kept running away," he said, but you always made sure I could find you, and because you never wanted to escape from me, and you just wanted to know I would come looking." "That is not," she started. "I will always come looking, Alindra," he said, "and that is not a promise, and it is not a choice, and it is just what I am." She was shaking, and tears were falling again, and she pressed her face against his chest. "I am 300 years old," she said, and her voice was muffled against his shirt, "and I will live for 3,000 more, and you are human and fragile and temporary, and I will watch you age while I stay the same. I know, Marcus said. My father will disapprove, she said, and a princess and her human guard, and there will be scandals and political complications, and everyone will say it is impossible. I know, Marcus said. I am terrified, she said, and I have never been this scared, and I do not know how to do this, I know. Marcus said, and he pressed a kiss against the top of her head. And I am scared too. She looked up at him, and her eyes were wide and wet and vulnerable. You are, she asked. Yes, he said. Of course. I am, and you are ancient and powerful, and you could have anyone in the galaxy. And I am just a human soldier with scars and nightmares, and a lifespan that will feel like a heartbeat to you. But Marcus, she started, but I am also stubborn, he said. And I am also relentless. And I'm also completely and utterly in love with you. And I've been since the moment you asked me to say your name. Alindra stared at him, and something in her expression shifted, and walls crumbled and defenses fell, and 300 years of careful emotional distance collapsed in an instant. Say it again, she whispered. Your name, he asked. No, she said, and the other thing I love. You, Marcus said, and the words were easy, and they were true. And they felt like coming home. She kissed him. Her lips were cool against his warmth, and gentle and desperate at once, and she tasted like starlight and coffee and something that might have been tears, and it was the best kiss of his entire life. I love you too, she said against his mouth, and I love you, and I have loved you since you walked into that room and looked at me like I was a puzzle to solve instead of a princess to worship. You are a puzzle, Marcus said. And he smiled against her lips. I know, she said, and I am also yours, and if you will have me, always. Marcus said, and the word was a vow and a promise and a declaration of war against every obstacle that would try to separate them. She pressed her forehead against his, and her breath mixed with his breath, and her heart beat against his heart, and for a moment they existed outside of time and species and expectation. You were assigned to protect me, she said. Yes, Marcus said, and I kept running away, she said. Yes, Marcus said. And now, she said, and her lips curved into a smile. Now you have caught me, Marcus said. And or maybe I have caught you, and or maybe we have caught each other. She laughed, and it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. I think, she said, and I think maybe we were always supposed to find each other. And I think maybe I was running toward you the whole time. Marcus held her close and felt her cold against his warmth, and felt her ancient heart beating against his temporary chest, and felt complete for the first time in his entire life. Outside the healing chamber, the galaxy continued. Its eternal spinning, and wars were fought, and treaties signed, and species rose and fell across the endless stars. But in that small room full of light and love, a human soldier and an alien princess found something that transcended the vast, cold darkness of space. They found home. They found each other. And they found the simple, terrifying, beautifully human truth that love was never a weakness. It was the fire that made humanity reach for the stars, and the gravity that brought them back to the arms of the ones they cherished. Marcus had been assigned to protect her. She had run away just to be near him. And in the end, they had both found exactly where they belonged together.